Ah, the moment arrived. Look who finally stopped asking for permission to be dangerous. Not loud, not reckless, not desperate. Dangerous in the quiet way that makes rooms shift when you enter and conversations change tone, without anyone knowing why. You can feel it, can't you? That internal click. That point where something in you stopped negotiating. For a long time, they thought you were manageable. They watched your patience and mistook it for weakness. They studied your silence and labeled it submission. They leaned on your kindness like it was an open door instead of a boundary you were still learning how to build. They tested you slowly at first, small pressures, minor disrespect disguised as jokes, subtle expectations placed on your shoulders to see how much you would carry without complaint. And you carried it, not because you were weak, but because you were learning. They pushed a little harder, crossed lines to see if you'd flinch, withheld validation to see if you'd chase it, created confusion to see if you'd doubt yourself. They thought they were mapping your limits. What they didn't realize was that every test they gave you was also revealing them to you. Every manipulation showed you a pattern. Every inconsistency taught you where not to invest. Every pressure point trained you to stop bleeding in public. You didn't harden overnight. This wasn't rage. This wasn't bitterness. This wasn't revenge. This was clarity arriving slowly, the way sunrise does, quietly, then all at once. There was a moment, maybe late at night, when the noise finally stopped, when you looked at the ceiling and realized you were exhausted, not because life was hard, but because you were still explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, still shrinking your truth to fit rooms that were never built for you, still asking permission to exist fully. That's when something changed. You stopped reacting, not out of apathy, but out of precision. You stopped responding to bait, stopped clarifying things that didn't deserve clarification, stopped proving things to people who benefited from doubting you, and suddenly the same people who felt so comfortable pushing you started feeling unsure. Because here's the thing they never planned for. A person who no longer seeks validation is impossible to control. They tried the old tactics: guilt, silence, withholding, warmth, rewriting the story so you'd feel like the problem again. But nothing landed the way it used to. The buttons were still there, but they weren't connected anymore. The strings were visible now, and once you see the strings, the performance loses its power. You didn't announce your change. You didn't warn anyone. You didn't make a scene. You simply stopped abandoning yourself. And that's when you became dangerous. Not because you threatened anyone. Not because you fought back, but because you stopped being available for manipulation. They noticed it in small ways at first. The way you paused before answering. The way your no stopped coming with explanations. The way your presence felt grounded instead of eager. They felt it in your silence. Not empty silence. Weighted silence. The kind that says, I see exactly what's happening here, and I'm choosing not to participate. You started responding instead of reacting, choosing instead of complying, observing instead of absorbing, and, while they were still playing the old game, you quietly walked off the board. This is the part they don't understand. They think danger looks like aggression, like loud defiance, like destruction. But real danger, the kind that dismantles unhealthy dynamics, looks like someone who knows who they are and doesn't need permission to be that person. Your boundaries didn't come from anger. They came from self-respect, finally outweighing your fear of being misunderstood. Your distance didn't come from coldness. It came from discernment. Your calm didn't come from numbness. It came from regulation. You stopped giving people access just because they asked for it. Stopped explaining your depth to people committed to staying shallow. Stopped lighting yourself on fire to keep dynamics alive that were built on imbalance. And the moment you stopped needing their approval, something irreversible happened. they lost leverage. Because leverage only exists when someone is willing to trade their peace for acceptance. You no longer do that. They can't guilt you into compliance anymore because you've made peace with disappointing people who never truly saw you. They can't confuse you anymore because you trust your internal signals more than external noise. They can't provoke you into emotional chaos because you've already sat with your darkness and survived it. You don't need to dominate. You don't need to intimidate. You don't need to win arguments. Your power is quieter than that. It's in the way you don't rush to respond, the way you choose clarity over chaos, the way you walk away without needing the last word. They feel it because systems built on control collapse when faced with someone who governs themselves. You became immune to the need for constant reassurance, immune to being liked at the cost of your integrity, immune to narratives that only work if you doubt yourself. And that immunity, that's what changed everything. They keep replaying old versions of you in their mind, trying to figure out where the shift happened, when you stopped bending, when you stopped explaining, when you stopped being available for emotional extraction. But the truth is, this wasn't a moment. It was a process. Every boundary you didn't enforce taught you why you needed one. Every time you stayed silent instead of reacting, you strengthened your nervous system. Every time you chose yourself without announcing it, you reclaimed another piece of your autonomy. You didn't become dangerous overnight, you became precise. And precision is terrifying to people who rely on chaos, confusion, and emotional leverage. Now they approach you differently, more carefully, more cautiously, some with forced kindness, some with sudden respect, not because you demanded it, but because they can feel that you are no longer negotiable. You don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to prove anything. Your energy does the talking now. You've entered a phase where your presence alone filters who belongs and who doesn't, where your standards replace your explanations, where your peace matters more than being understood. And this is only the beginning, because once you stop asking for permission to be dangerous, once you stop seeking approval to protect your boundaries, once you stop betraying yourself to keep fragile dynamics alive, there's no going back to who you were. The old version of you existed to survive. This version exists to choose, and what you're choosing next. They can feel it coming. And this is where it deepens, because becoming dangerous wasn't the end of the transformation. It was the threshold. What you stepped into next was something far more unsettling for the people who once relied on your predictability. You stopped needing an outcome. That's the part no one talks about. Most control works because people want something: approval, closure, belonging, recognition, and apology. When those desires are leverage, and you used to have them just like everyone else. But somewhere along the way, quietly, painfully, you let them burn off. You didn't decide to become indifferent. Indifference arrived as a side effect of honesty. You looked at your life and asked a question that rearranged everything. What happens if I stop negotiating with people who benefit from my self-doubt? At first, the answer was terrifying, because letting go meant loss. Distance, misunderstanding, loneliness. And you felt all of it. But then, something unexpected happened. The loneliness sharpened into clarity. The distance turned into perspective, and the misunderstanding stopped hurting once you realized it wasn't your job to correct it. You began to see the pattern. The people who were most unsettled by your boundaries were the ones who relied on your flexibility. The ones who accused you of changing were the ones who benefited from you staying the same. The ones who suddenly labeled you cold were the ones who used to feed on your warmth without offering any in return. That's when the illusion collapsed. You weren't becoming dangerous to them because you were attacking. You were becoming dangerous because you were no longer available for extraction. And extraction is what most unhealthy dynamics are built on. They extract your time, your emotional labor, your patience, your forgiveness, your silence. You gave those things freely once, not because you were foolish, but because you believed in connection. But belief without boundaries becomes self-erasure. So you learned not loudly, not dramatically. You learned by watching how your body reacted when you said yes out of obligation. You learned by noticing the exhaustion that followed certain conversations. You learned by paying attention to who respected your no, and who treated it like an inconvenience. And slowly, something in you recalibrated. You stopped explaining your boundaries to people who weren't listening. Stopped justifying your needs to people who dismissed them. Stopped shrinking your truth to keep others comfortable. You didn't become harsh. You became exact, and exactness feels threatening to people who survive on ambiguity. No, here's the part they truly didn't anticipate. Once you stop needing validation, fear loses its grip. Fear only works when there's something to lose. You used to fear being misunderstood, fear being abandoned, fear being seen as too much. But you've already lived through those outcomes. You've been misunderstood and survived. You've been abandoned and rebuilt. You've been labeled too much and learned that too much for the wrong people is exactly right for you. So what's left to threaten you with? That's the moment the balance of power shifts. Not outwardly, internally. They sense it in the way you don't rush anymore, the way urgency no longer controls your decisions, the way you pause before responding, not to calculate manipulation, but because you don't owe anyone immediacy. Your stillness unnerves them, because stillness suggests choice, and choice is the opposite of control. You've stopped being reactive, stopped living in defense mode, stopped anticipating other people's expectations before forming your own. You're no longer running simulations in your head about how to keep the peace. Peace is no longer something you negotiate for. It's something you enforce. This is where your danger becomes structural. You're not just resilient anymore. You're self-contained. Your sense of worth doesn't spike or collapse based on how others treat you. Your mood doesn't hinge on approval. Your direction doesn't depend on consensus. You move differently now, not faster. Cleaner, you choose where to invest. You choose where to disengage. You choose what deserves your energy, and the most unsettling part for others. You don't announce those choices. You just make them. One day, they realize they no longer have access to you the way they used to. The emotional shortcuts are gone. The guilt hooks don't catch. The old scripts fall flat. They say the same words, use the same tone, deploy the same tactics, and get nothing. No reaction, no collapse, no apology, just clarity. And clarity is devastating to manipulation. Because manipulation depends on confusion. You're not confused anymore. You know who you are when no one is watching. You know what you will and won't tolerate. You know the cost of betraying yourself, and you've decided it's too high. This is why your danger doesn't look like destruction. It looks like inevitability, like gravity. You don't need to confront everyone who wronged you. Your absence does the work. You don't need to explain why you changed. Your consistency does the work. You don't need to demand respect. Your standards do the work. They feel the shift in social spaces, the way conversations adjust around you, the way certain people become cautious, uncertain how to engage, not because you're intimidating, but because you're no longer malleable. They can't mold you into what they need anymore, and that forces them to confront something uncomfortable. The relationship only worked when you were smaller. You've outgrown it. That realization doesn't always come with apologies. Sometimes it comes with resistance, with projection, with attempts to pull you back into old roles. But those attempts don't land, because you're not anchored to those identities anymore. You are not the fixer, not the peacekeeper, not the emotional buffer. You are the chooser, and choice, real choice, terrifies systems built on obligation. Here's the truth you've started living. Whether you consciously named it or not, you don't owe access to anyone who disrespects your boundaries. You don't owe explanations for protecting your peace. You don't owe loyalty to dynamics that require self-betrayal. That doesn't make you cruel. It makes you sovereign. And sovereignty is what they mistake for danger. Because a sovereign person can't be coerced, can't be guilted, can't be manipulated into compliance. They can only be respected or avoided. This is why some people fade quietly out of your life now. Not with conflict, not with drama, just distance. They sense that the version of you they knew no longer exists. And, instead of adapting, they retreat. That's not loss. That's filtration. Your world is becoming quieter, not emptier, cleaner, not smaller. And, in that quiet, something else is forming, discernment. You don't react to every challenge anymore. You don't engage every provocation. You don't correct every misunderstanding. You've learned that silence, when chosen consciously, is not submission. It's authorship. You decide where your voice matters and where it doesn't. This is the phase where your danger matures into mastery, where your boundaries stop feeling defensive and start feeling natural, where your confidence isn't performative, it's embodied, where your presence alone communicates more than explanations ever could. You don't need to be seen as powerful. You simply are. And that's what destabilizes people who rely on performance, hierarchy, and control, because they can't compete with something that isn't playing. They can't provoke someone who isn't reactive. They can't dominate someone who doesn't need them. They can't diminish someone who defines themselves internally. You've stepped into a different operating system now. One where peace is not passive, where kindness is not permission, where patience is not weakness. And the most important shift of all, you no longer measure your growth by how others respond to you. You measure it by how aligned you feel with yourself. And alignment is a force multiplier. Everything you do from here carries weight, not because you demand attention, but because you don't need it. This isn't the end of the transformation. It's the point where the consequences begin to unfold. Subtly, quietly, inevitably. And the people who once tested you, they're still trying to understand what happened, still looking for the moment you became dangerous. They won't find it, because it wasn't a moment. It was a choice you made again and again in silence, and you're still making it.